I'd like to start the annual meeting of the Rocky Hill Historical Society today, May 19th, 2022. The annual meeting tonight, well, first off, let me say, as far as some Zoom etiquette, if you would keep yourself on mute, that would probably be best. And if you have something to say, please feel free to either raise your hand and somebody will notice and tell me or tell Jack, and we'll get you in. Questions or you may ask at any time throughout the evening. And that's about it for Zoom. You could also, well, not it, but if you wanted to add a chat, somebody will be monitoring the chat box as well. So questions or comments could go in there. Okay. So let's get on with our annual meeting. It'll be a quick one. We're going to probably take 20, 30 minutes at the most. And then after that, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Francis Coan. That will take about 45 minutes. And then after that, it'll take questions and answers. His subject tonight is migration through maps, cartography. So let's get into our annual meeting, unless there's a question from the group. Okay, seeing none then, good. All right, so what has to happen, here's the agenda, and I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, and so we can get to our presentation. As you see, the first bullet said, it said the president presides over reports and activities of the society. One of the things we do yearly is we put out a newsletter just before our annual meeting, and that in essence are the reports of the society. The activities of the society, if you go onto Facebook, you will see basically are the history and pictures and events. But I'm gonna run through them for last year, not physically, but I'm gonna just speak through them. So excuse me for being a talking head for a few minutes, but I will do. So we want to acknowledge Bob Heron, our town historian, who wrote probably 8 articles entitled From the Archives, Rediscovering Our History, Childbirth, Library, Fallen Heroes, Ames, World War I, and Rocky Hill in World War I. So we want to certainly thank Bob, who basically did that throughout the whole year. Another big activity that we've been going through is our library renovation. We want to thank our friends certainly at the Christine E. Mosier Foundation for supporting us. And we went through our entire library and we culled a lot of books and organized all the different items. We give thanks to Lori Wallace, who spent a year and a half, Susan Carpuck and myself and other volunteers that jumped in. We did open up for Memorial Day. So we were here, we'll be here at this coming Memorial Day. You want to stop in, feel free. We began what we called our Making History series, and one of the events was, or programs was Tracing Your Family History, which was done by Tim Honan, and it was like a genealogy 101. We participated in 4 farmers markets that was led by Vice President Jack Casella. John Serra was out there. That was a lot of fun. And Jack also did a program with Bob Heron called Boats of the Connecticut River. And these programs you could find on our website if you go under research and video. We did a hike in the quarry. I led that hike. We had Center Cemetery tours led by Bob Heron. We had a holiday party. We did some work in the museum. We created a new wall when you first come in, a new display on the wall, I should say. What else do we have? And then we began our Friends of Center Cemetery in this current year. In January, we began to meet. We started lobbying the town in regards to getting some money and also getting a new website for the Center Cemetery. That's in the works right now. We received a grant from the Connecticut Humanities where we're looking at creating a new display for our museum. We had a program called Who Are We? And it was run through the Sustainable Rocky Hill Group. and you can see that video as well on our website. We have a new banner on the Silestine Highway. If you look at the light posts over by the Rocky Hill, Sunoco. And we have a full calendar for 2022. And this is it right here. And if you are on our email list, this was all sent out to you, but we have lots of things that are happening. Our next event, and Jack is all excited about this, would be in June 16th. We'll have the car show, and you could read the rest of them. Mixation, library grand opening, lots of things happening here. Among the cataloging and organizing of artifacts, photos, papers, and what have you. So that's my quick report in regards to the activities that went on this past year. Any questions or comments anybody like to make? Okay. So we'll move on. Certainly, thank you to all the volunteers who participated in this. And if you're interested in volunteering, contact me, contact anybody in regards to the Historical Society. We're at info@rhhistory@gmail.com. Okay, so moving on with the annual meeting agenda. John, do you have a short report for us?
Well, basically, this year our total assets increased from $47,000 to $52,000, an increase of over $4,000 from previous year. I mean, from year to year. And I think that's really been pretty good because of the coronavirus and what it's done, you know, to everybody in general. So, I mean, I think we did very well that way. Out of that, we've had a couple of new grants that have come in, and we're using those for updating our inventory, our museum itself, which is really helping quite a bit. The thing that really went down a little bit this year was our PayPal usage, and that was for people buying various items online and membership dues. And those went down about $125 from the previous year, which, to be honest with you, I don't think is really that bad. Overall, I think we've done very well as far as financial speaking from last year. And I think it's about all I really say without really getting deep into it.
Thank you, John. Thank you. All right, now we're moving on to our nominating chair, Tim Honan, who's going to read the slate of recommended officers, which is right in here in the red. So every year we go through just the officers right here, Tim, and we need to re-up everybody who wants to be re-elected or new folks coming in. So Tim, you're on mute still. You tested it before, didn't you?
There we go.
Yeah.
Hey, he didn't.
There we go. Yeah, what I would like to do is present the results or the selections for the nominating committee. For president, we selected Ed Ciccarello to continue. Vice President Jack Casello, Secretary Nancy Burtwell, and Treasurer John Serra. These are all continuations from the previous year. They've all done a fine job, and hopefully will continue for a long time to do a fine job. So that is that's the results of the nominating committee. Do I need to make a motion to approve them at this point?
Yes, just we want to take Jack off because Jack is already he served only 1 year out of his 2-year term, so he'll be renewed next year. So it's Ed, Nancy, and John. Yeah, if you could make a motion, and then
with
second.
With that, I'd like to make a motion to approve for President Ed Ciccarello, for Secretary Nancy Burtwell, and Treasurer John Serra.
Can we get a
I'll
second?
second that.
Thank you, Lori.
Can I suggest we do a show of hands since we're all muted?
Yes, and if we're all in favor, please raise your hand, and there you go. Can't vote, I guess I could vote for other people. All right, just looking, I don't know that. All right, thank you. All right, so the next part of this then is, thank you, Tim, is basically me appointing chair people of the standing committees and then the executive committee approving this. So you see in the red, I'll also read the ones in the black, but right now our finance chair is Sandy. She just started, so then we're going to nominate Marilyn, or I'm going to nominate Marilyn as president for the membership chair. Right, currently, we don't have a program chair. I am the interim. Lori does not have to be nominated because she started in 2019. Gail does not have to be nominated because she started in 2021 for publicity. And currently, we have an opening in the museum displays. So those are the 1, 2, 3. Maryland, actually, no, the only person that needs to be voted on is Marilyn by the executive committee this time. So I nominate Marilyn Pittman to be our membership chair. The executive committee only, please, yay, raise your hand. If, or excuse me, a second, please.
I'll
first.
second. I'll
Larry
second that.
seconded it. And all in favor, please raise your hand. There you go. Beautiful. Marilyn, I think Jack talked to you also about the volunteer chair being part of that membership, right? Yes,
He's muted.
Marilyn, you're muted. I just wanted a confirmation.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. Okay, this is a non-voting special committee, the volunteer committee. Sure.
All right, well, we'll talk about that as we go further. Let's be non-committal about that. Why don't we do that? Okay?
I'm good.
Oh, you're good with it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so again, non-voting special committee. I'd like to have Marilyn as the chair of that. Can I get a second?
Second.
Jack seconds it. All in favor, please. Executive committee only, please.
Aye.
Thank you, Marilyn. You can vote for yourself now because you're a member of the executive committee. Way to go. All right, moving on. The audit committee has been Sandy. Is Sandy even here tonight? I don't see her.
Here yet.
So I'm going to leave that off, seeing that she's not here. Okay, moving on quickly with our annual meeting. We now have a change to our bylaws, and this is going to be discussed by our Vice President, Jack Casella.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a little background. The language is there. You can look at it. The red indicates changes from the previous bylaw, but the background to this is the Finance Committee performed a 6-month review of investment and banking alternatives because we weren't satisfied with the return we were getting on the, John told you we have $50,000 and we're getting pennies a month as a return. So we were looking for a better return on our assets, and we wanted to use a conservative approach and definitely avoid any loss of assets. So we reviewed our existing banking arrangement. We explored investment in the market with an advisor, and we also approached another bank asking them to create a portfolio, including investment and banking accounts to meet our needs. We've discussed the results of this research over the last 6 months, and we're in the process of making a move of our accounts. So this language needs to be in our bylaws to give authority to the Finance Committee to do what we want to do. So we're asking for a positive vote tonight so that the Finance Committee can now move forward. Thank you.
Okay, Jack, would you like to make a motion then?
I make a motion that we accept.
I have a
the-
question.
Sure.
First we'll make a motion in a second, then we
Oh.
could discuss it.
Okay, got it.
Okay. I make the motion that we accept the revisions to the section 4, section 6, standing committee, finance committee, as indicated on the screen in
Can
red.
I get a, thank you, Jack. Can I get a second, please?
I'll second.
That was seconded by Lori. And now for discussion, Marilyn?
Yeah, I remember seeing this before, but never really had an opportunity to express my confusion about it. But at the beginning where it says treasurer and at least two, there's two questions that come to my mind. Does the treasurer need to have a financial background? And how many people are on this committee? 2 or 3? I'm confused about how many people will be on the committee and whether the treasurer needs to have financial background.
Jack, you're the maker of the motion. Would you like to answer that?
Sure. Well, the treasurer does have to have a financial background, and currently our treasurer is John, and he does have a financial background. He worked for the state for like 30 years.
Is that under the treasurer description that the treasurer needs to have a financial background? It's just in the context of this sentence, it's kind of confusing.
Okay.
Oh,
I do think I don't have that bylaw in front of me or that job description in front of me, but I believe that does require someone, but we can check that. And as far as the number of people, right now, there's 4 people on the committee, including the treasurer.
So does the at least 2, does that mean at least 2 additional members?
At least 2 additional members. yeah.
Okay, the absence of the word additional leaves that open.
Okay.
And it could be interpreted that the treasurer and 1 other people, that would make 2 members.
Okay.
If you understand where I'm
Are
coming
you,
Right.
are you suggesting that we add the word additional in then?
Yeah,
Well, would you like to make a motion and let a friendly amendment to, and see if the maker of the motion would agree with that?
they'll be comprised of the treasurer and at least 2 additional members. Both of whom have financial background. That might separate it from the whole treasurer thing. You know what I'm saying?
Okay,
Both of whom, BOTH. Rise of the treasurer and at least 2 additional members, both of whom have. That's much more understandable. Thank you.
so Marilyn, are you making a motion, make a motion then to add these in? So,
I make a motion that we add the word additional and if we change the phrase to additional members, both of whom have financial background.
okay, Jack, we'll just look at it as a friendly amendment. Jack, you approve? You agree with that?
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
Okay,
yep.
good. Any other discussion? Thank you for clarifying that, Marilyn. All right, if there's no other discussion, then this is a vote for the all the members, not just the executive committee, but all the members of the society. So those in favor, please signify by raising your hand. Marilyn, you're a member, so you're right. And any opposed? Help me out if you see anybody that was opposed. None? All right, so that motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Jack. And that is how is that? The quickest annual meeting on Zoom that you've ever been to? 20 minutes. I like that.
Yay.
I love it. Well, all right. So I am going to stop my sharing. And Dr. Coan, do you have something that you want to put up on the screen? Okay, you're on mute for now. Unmute yourself.
I'm as bad as everybody else. Sorry about it.
That's a natural thing that happens. So
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
should be able to take over the screen and share.
Okay. Let
Tell
me
me
see
if
if,
you tell me if you cannot.
all right. Here we go. I'm getting a message. You cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing.
All right, my bad. Thank you.
So let me.
Now try
Yep,
that
we're good
again.
now. Here we go.
Hold on 1 second. Everybody can see that?
Yep.
Hold on 1 second, if you would. How do I don't see my screen at all, though. Here we go. All right. Now, let me introduce our presenter for this evening. Dr. Francis Michael Coan is a great-grandson of Irish immigrants. He was born and raised in Bristol, Connecticut, where his family has resided since 1906. He holds a BA in geography and a MA in history from Central Connecticut State University and a PhD in history from the University of Connecticut. Primarily a military historian, he wrote his dissertation on the origins and early history of the Connecticut National Guard and has published a number of encyclopedia entries and book reviews on military topics. He's hired as an adjunct instructor in 1991. He has taught history, American government, and geography at Tunxus Community College for the past 31 years. And I want to welcome Dr. Coan, and I give you the floor. I give you the computer screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me. It's an honor. I also want to thank Bob Heron, who I had a conversation with before this event. And that really informed this event to a large extent. You all know Bob's done a lot of research in terms of Rocky Hill's changing ethnic patterns. So it might be interesting to compare my kind of macro view of American immigration with, Rocky Hill as the micro view. And I think you're probably going to find a lot of commonalities there. So this presentation grew out of one I did in 2019 for the Avon Public Library. The director there wanted to do something with maps, and the theme was immigration. And I mentioned, well, I do have a background in geography. It's my undergraduate degree. So she was all excited, and I put something together which she liked. And so what you're going to see is something that's evolved since 2019. And I did try to update it too, as much as I could, drawing on more current census data from the 2020 census where I could. And to me, my degrees are in geography and history. Those disciplines are very much allied disciplines. You really can't do history without understanding geography. And certainly to some extent, you can't do cultural geography without understanding history either. So to me, this is sort of a natural blend of things. So let's jump into this. I don't know how you want to handle questions, Ed. There are a lot of ways to do it. People could just hold their questions to the end or put questions in chat, but it's a relatively small group. So I'd suggest maybe holding them till the end. It might be easier. But certainly if people do want to put something in the chat, you could look at that too. All right, so let's see. I don't know if you can see the screen of faces that I can see on your screen on the far right. Is that blocking the slide?
No.
Okay.
On the far right, I see maritime route, and that's South America. That's the extent of the right-hand side, yes?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah,
Okay.
I just want to make sure you can see this well. All right. So technically, we're not looking at immigration here, but we're looking at migrants. So I decided in doing this overview of American immigration, we should go back to the very first people who inhabited what is now the United States, particularly the lower 48 states. And this is certainly much more the realm of archaeology than it is history, but nonetheless, it's through archaeology we have some understanding of how people got here, and that understanding's rapidly evolving also. So the right-hand set of, or the left-hand, I should say, set of slides, the understanding that still holds relevance is people migrated from Asia, and they did so back perhaps 35 to 40,000 years ago, perhaps even a little longer than that, when obviously the world was still in the midst of the most recent ice age. So sea levels were lower, perhaps 200 or 300 feet. And what is now the Bering Sea would have been dry land. So the thinking is from 43,000 to 36,000 years ago, people were migrating out of what is now Siberia into this area, which has been named Beringia. Now they're going to be kind of stuck there for 20,000 years because of the ice sheet in North America. It hadn't melted yet, and they couldn't survive on that ice sheet and migrate very far. Obviously, there'd be nothing to eat, let alone dealing with the cold temperatures, etc. Probably a relatively small number of people we're talking about, 8 to 10,000. They're hunter-gatherers. And in fact, this far back, and in this region particularly, there'd be no way of growing much of anything anyway. The climate's still very harsh. About 16,000 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, the ice sheets start to melt, and now these people, again, a subset of these people start to migrate into North America and eventually into what's now South America. The big debate right now, two things. How long ago did this first migration happen? Because it seems year after year that the initial group, the thinking is they came earlier. I don't know if you know anything about the Clovis cultures. I'm sure that rings a bell for a lot of you, but you know, for decades, the thinking was the Clovis peoples were the first here, 13 or 14,000 years ago. But certainly by the 70s, there was all sorts of archaeological evidence to suggest, no, there were people here before them. And the current thinking is maybe 18,000 years, maybe 19,000 years ago, there were people here. The big debate is when these first people migrated out of Asia, did they go overland and spread out from there? The more recent thinking is they went by sea along a coastal route. One of the oldest sites, very well documented, is a place called Monteverde in Chile that's been dated back 18,500 years ago. So there are other sites almost as old, and they're scattered all over North and South America. Monteverde is a coastal site. The Channel Islands is a very old one. Besides the archaeological evidence, the other benefit of traveling this route would have been twofold. One, these people are going by sea. They simply have to laden boats with their goods, and they wouldn't have that many goods and their people, and they can move pretty easily. The coastal route would have been ice-free sooner than in also, we know that. And thirdly, food resources were abundant along this route. Not only could they access food from the land, the coastal areas, they could access from the sea. So the thinking increasingly is this is actually the route the earliest migrants took. It was a coastal route, and only later did people migrate overland. But nonetheless, within a relatively small amount of time, they're all over the place. And obviously, these are the ancestors of the Native Americans, all of them, that would eventually evolve into, literally hundreds of different tribes or nations. So by the time Columbus arrives, it's a polyglot group of peoples, but their ancestors are these people. I should add, another debate is how many migrations. We really don't know that for sure. The ancestors of the Inuit, the Eskimo people, it seems came later. They were a later migration. Not all immigrants come by choice. So this is certainly probably the greatest forced migration in human history. It's got to rank right up there. And certainly this impacts the history of the United States. We're talking about the African slave trade. So this great forced migration of peoples from Africa, primarily to the New World. This actually predates Columbus to some extent. Europeans, for example, the Spanish were importing slaves in places like the Canary Islands, even before Columbus. Not huge numbers, but nonetheless. So hence this little arrow here. But obviously the big migration is after Columbus. It's after Europeans, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the rest come to the New World and start exploiting the resources. And they need a labor force, a stable labor force. And that would be Africans. You know, the flow lines indicate the relative number of people. And as you see here, the vast majority of slaves actually were imported into Portuguese Brazil. That was the biggest area where they ended up. By far, the next biggest area is the Caribbean. The United States, what is now the United States, was a relatively small market, believe it or not, for slaves. Maybe 400,000 in the whole history of the slave trade. But obviously those people, again, would be the ancestors of most people who are African Americans. It would be these folks. We don't have to get into the whole history of slavery here, but obviously in both Brazil and in the Caribbean, they're growing plantation crops. In the Caribbean, it would have been sugar. Brazil to a large extent too, but other things as well. The 15 to 20 million, it's 15 to 20 million people estimated were brought over during the history of the slave trade, roughly 1450 to 1860. We don't know for sure the numbers because the records aren't complete and they're not perfect. And by the way, that does not include the number of slaves who died along the way, which would have been certainly in the millions. So this is a huge number of people brought over against their will, as it turns out. Well, let's jump to the 13 colonies. I think it's easy for people to believe that since they were 13 British or originally English colonies, that the vast majority of people there were English or British. And that's not really true. So even early on, the 13 colonies that would become the 13 first states of the United States were quite pluralistic ethnically and culturally, and would actually become more so over time. So in 1700, the total population, and obviously some of these colonies hadn't been established yet in 1700, most had, but Georgia didn't exist, for example. The Carolina colony was one, etc. But it's only about 250,000 people. And when I say people, it's not Indians. They wouldn't count, they'd be separate nations. About 75% of them English. By 1775, that population increased about tenfold. But now the percentage of English settlers was down to only about 50%. Now that would vary quite a bit by region. New England remained the most English part of the 13 colonies, right up to the time of the Revolution. But even there, you would have had other groups to some extent. Obviously, some other huge groups are, if we look at the Black population, and these are overwhelmingly slaves. Keep in mind, they were significant, if we can call them an ethnic group. It's really multiple ethnic groups, but they were a significant part of the culture in colonial America. You have the Dutch, particularly in the Hudson Valley and surrounding regions. Some French settlers. And the people who came later, who in significant numbers, primarily in the 1700s, not so much the 1600s, the Scots-Irish, and the Germans. And they tended to settle on the frontier, partly because if they were interested in farming, for the most part, the best farmland was gone. So they kind of had to go inland. So I think that's worth pointing out, that the idea of a melting pot, ethnic pluralism, cultural pluralism, it predates the United States. It already was in existence at the time the United States came into being. It's nothing new. As the country expanded westward and southward to some extent, and acquired territory, not only did it acquire territory, it acquired new citizens who, in many cases, literally woke up one morning to find out, hey, we're in the United States now. So consider Florida, the United States purchasing it from Spain, really sort of by force. Texas, the Mexican cession. In every case, the United States, actually before that, Louisiana, not only acquired a territory, it acquired people who would become United States citizens, people from different ethnic backgrounds, different nationalities, Spanish, French, and so forth. Obviously, along the way, the native peoples too. They would not be citizens, interestingly enough, until 1924. It took that long for Congress to actually make American Indians or Native American citizens. Until then, they were treated as people of separate nations, actually. And the same thing would happen when the United States started to develop a relatively small but far-flung overseas empire. And most of this would have been the later 19th century, the era right after the Spanish-American War in 1898, but some of it would predate that event. So again, ultimately, these people too would be incorporated into American citizenship at various times. Puerto Rico, 1917, Puerto Ricans were made American citizens. And the dates would have varied for some of the people of the Pacific Islands. But again, adding to this cultural pluralism. Demographers and historians of immigration refer to three waves of American immigration. And the first wave is the largest part of the 19th century. And what we see here is some shifting patterns. So 1820, Britain would have certainly been still the largest source of immigration to the United States. So that colonial tie hadn't entirely disappeared. And you see even during this period, Britain is still a major source of immigrants to the US. France might have showed up on this list early on. But certainly once we get to the 1840s now, we're going to look at two groups in particular, the Germans and the Irish, coming in very large numbers to the United States. And we're also going to look at a couple of other groups a little bit. Canadians, who are sort of an overlooked group of immigrants to the United States, and sort of a constant. Canada has always sent immigrants here, but nobody pays much attention to them, I guess, for whatever reason. And then, particularly later in this period, the Chinese also. So this is one of a few maps I have borrowed from Pew. With their permission, Pew has very generous usage standards. In fact, you can use their materials freely, and they're wonderful, by the way. They do a lot of reports on various things, including immigration. They only have two requirements: that one gives them credit, which I've done here, and that one does not advocate a position on the issue. So I'll try to avoid advocating a position on immigration, although, after, if you want to pin me down, you might be able to. But what this map shows is by state, the largest foreign-born ethnic or national group. And this is based on census data, which is why the year is 1850. So there are some limitations to this. We don't know what the second biggest group is in each state, and it might have been almost as big as the first. We don't know exactly when these people arrived, but it certainly gives you a really good idea of what was going on in terms of immigration at any given period, particularly in any given census year. And you see clearly here, every state except Vermont, it's either the Irish or the Germans are the largest foreign-born group in the state. The other exception would have been Mexico for California. Keep in mind, California became a state in 1850. So you literally had a lot of Mexican citizens now who were US citizens. So the Germans are, again, one of these overlooked immigrant groups, and there could be multiple reasons for that. I think a lot of it has to do with the world wars, and the fact that the United States fought Germany twice during that period, so they might not have wanted to draw attention to themselves. But it's, actually, the Germans are the largest self-identified ethnic group in the United States to this day, interestingly enough. But one wouldn't necessarily think of them as being that. So this map was created in 2016. It's the most recent one I could find, but it shows you percentages of people with German roots by county. And you see clearly the Germans are clustered in the Great Lakes the Midwest, and the plains, kind of the upper plains. Particularly, that's an area of very heavy German ancestry. But even beyond that, throughout a good part of the middle of the country, lots of people with German roots. The Germans tended to settle inland, as this map indicates. They came to the seaboard cities, but they tended to go up the Hudson, the Erie Canal, the Great Lakes, or up the Mississippi, down the Ohio. And again, they tended to settle here. And you still see that clustering to this day of their ancestors. Another interesting study one can do is toponyms. And this is just a random sample of place names named for places in Germany that would have reflected places named by German immigrants. And they're all over the United States, including places like Texas that actually has a pretty significant number of German Americans. I think first and foremost, we think of Pennsylvania, and rightfully so. You do see Pennsylvania has a lot of people of German ancestry, but and many of them would have traced their ancestry back probably prior to the Revolution. But certainly from the 1840s on, the Germans are arriving and settling elsewhere. One thing I should mention is, why did they come? Multiple reasons. Part of it was simply they saw opportunity here. Most of them tended to be relatively well-to-do, often educated, professional people, and that's what they become here. Doctors, lawyers, businessmen, and so on. They would really build the American beer industry into a national industry. It's largely German immigrants. To some extent, they're being driven out of Germany. Keep in mind, there wasn't a united country until 1871. So it was a whole series of states. There were limited opportunities. Taxes were high. There was compulsory military service for men. So there were things driving them out too. There was a revolution in 1848. Some of them ended up on the wrong side of that. But at any rate, in the 1840s, they're coming in very, very large numbers from the 1840s on. And so too are the Irish, even larger numbers. And this map is based on 2020 census data. And you do see, it's a little hard to pick out, the concentration in the Northeast still. The Irish, again, came to the eastern seaboard cities, but unlike the Germans, they tended to stay there. They didn't tend as much to migrate farther. So places like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, very early on acquired large Irish populations and still have them to this day, their ancestors. Now we know why the Irish came primarily. It's the potato famine. I don't think I need to explain that to anybody. That was the primary driver in the 1840s, was to escape literally starvation or death by disease. So the population of Ireland, 1844, which would have been the year before the Great Famine, was about 8.4 million people. So by 1851, it's only 6.6 million. 1 million of those people literally died, either starvation or disease, and the rest had fled the country. They went to many places. They went to England, many of them. A significant number would go to Canada. Some would go as far as afield as places like Australia. But obviously, for our purposes, very many came to the United States in a short amount of time. Mostly poor, mostly lacking in skills that were valued here, not educated. So they were going to have a tougher time in many ways in terms of making a living, certainly, than the Germans did, and end up taking what work they could get. And that's what they did. So this is based on 2020 census data. The 5 states with the most Irish ancestry, they're all New England states. And I have had time to research this. Connecticut may well be number 6. I wouldn't be surprised. Connecticut still has a very large Irish American population. But you see that concentration in the Northeast that really began in the 1840s and 50s, and it's still there to this day. And then if we look at counties, there are a couple of interesting things to look at here. Again, mostly in the Northeast, including Massachusetts, Eastern Massachusetts particularly, and Boston is the most Irish city in the United States to this day. But you see a couple of counties in Montana with small populations, but a really high percentage of Irish Americans. And the answer to that is copper mining. Those are both copper mining counties. Silver Bow County is where the Butte mine was, which was one of the biggest copper mines in the world when it was active. And Deer Lodge County is where Anaconda Copper was located. So those were copper miners and their families. They ended up there, and these are their relatives down the years. So if we jump ahead to 1880, you still see the Irish and the Germans in very many states as being the #1 foreign-born group. But now we start to see more Mexicans showing up here. In many cases, these would have been laborers coming over the border to do agricultural labor. Cubans in Florida, and that's proximity to Florida, I'm sure. But let's look at the Canadians and the Chinese. Now they start to show up more as significant groups of immigrants in some of these states. I couldn't find a really good graphic to look at Canadian immigration, but clearly the great waves of immigration are tied to American industrial development. It was Canadians leaving, particularly Eastern Canada, coming to the United States, particularly the Northeast, looking for industrial work. They were cheap labor. And you start to see that in the 1840s. And after the Civil War, you've got a peak. And then the early part of the 20th century, it's the same thing. But kind of hidden here, there's a constant stream of Canadians here. It waxes and wanes. We've never had as big a group coming as since the teens and 20s. But it's a constant flow of people across the border from Canada. Many reasons for that. One is obviously proximity. The countries border one another. One, there's common heritage, particularly for the Anglophone Canadians, the English speakers. And relatively good relations too, certainly by the 20th century. So again, there was sort of an overlooked group. It's also interesting to contemplate that some of the Canadians have American ancestry, and that after the American Revolution, something like 70,000 American loyalists left the country and they moved to Canada. So you can have some interesting circumstances where Canadians actually trace their roots to colonial America and vice versa to some extent. And then the Chinese. So certainly from the mid-19th century on, they become a very significant part of the American population on the West Coast primarily. And they came here for a variety of reasons. Primarily, it's opportunity, it's work. China is already overcrowded, desperately poor, and there's work here. It's, for the most part, going to be hard manual labor, not for all, but for most. The Chinese, as you all know, I'm sure, were the people who, for the most part, built the Western railroads. It was Chinese workers who did that. In the East, early on, by the way, to a large extent, it was Irish workers, and the canals, too. But the Chinese would also be involved in the mining industry. But beyond that, many of them would become farmers. They become small businessmen. So it was really a diverse group of people. They weren't all working on the railroads, although very many of them were. All of these groups would face discrimination, more or less. The Irish were discriminated against on the basis of their Catholicism. That was one big problem. Large majority were Catholic, and they're moving into a country that's overwhelmingly Protestant. All sorts of tensions there. They're poor, they're unskilled, they're viewed as dirty, uncouth. The Germans, they're better off, but they're viewed as clannish, as too resistant to adopting the English language. So their attention is there. But the Chinese are discriminated against on the basis of simple ethnic bigotry. They're viewed as vastly different because they're not even Europeans at all. They're a lower form of humanity, increasingly. That's how Americans most would see them. So they face rampant discrimination. So you might ask the question, why did they keep coming? Because there was work. It's as simple as that. They put up with the rest. They had to, because there was opportunity here that was simply not available to them in China. Why did Americans want them here? Well, not all Americans did, but certainly the business interests did want them here. They wanted a cheap labor source to build those railroads and do other work. So the Chinese would be the first group that Congress would systematically seek to exclude from the United States through the Chinese Exclusion Act. So it put a 10-year moratorium, the original act, on immigration from China with some exceptions. That would be extended in 1892 and eventually made permanent. So the Chinese as a group, as a nationality, were almost literally barred from the United States with a few exceptions, but not too many. In 1943, this law would be repealed, but it was replaced with something that was pretty much the same thing. It was a really strict quota system. The only reason it was repealed in 1943 was the countries were allied in 1943, fighting the Japanese. So there was a sense that we don't want this sort of ugly law on the books, but really what replaced it was pretty much exactly the same thing. So this was simple bigotry. That Americans decided we don't want any more Chinese here, and we're simply going to, with very few exceptions, exclude them from coming. Something similar would happen to the Japanese during the Teddy Roosevelt administration, the first decade of the 20th century, where the so-called gentleman's agreement was reached, where there was rampant discrimination against Japanese immigrants, most living on the West Coast or in Hawaii. And Roosevelt reached an agreement with the Japanese where they would stop sending them. So there wouldn't be a law passed, but again, rampant discrimination against Asians in the United States. We also have to keep in mind that by the late 19th century, you had the rise of scientific racism, eugenics movement. That's certainly a big part of this too, and I'm going to come back to that. This idea that race has scientific basis and one can classify people by race, and that race is an indicator of intelligence and other human traits. And there's a hierarchy of race. And certainly the Asians were viewed sort of at the bottom of that hierarchy, or pretty close. So let's turn to the so-called second wave of immigration from the Gilded Age, the last part of the 19th century, until about 1930, the so-called new immigrants. So to a large extent, the immigrants that came prior to 1880 were to some extent Canadians, but primarily they're Northern and Western Europeans. Now that's going to change with one exception. We do have during this period a significant inflow of people from Scandinavia, over 1 million. Keep in mind, Sweden and Norway were actually combined kingdoms until 1905, when Norway gained its independence. So there would have been some Norwegians in here. You can throw in some Danes and some Finns too, but largely it's Swedes coming to the United States. And again, for the most part, looking for opportunity. But the big change is what you see here. It's immigrants now arriving not from Northern and Western Europe primarily, although they're still coming. It's a shift towards those coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And that's a big shift. And these people too would face discrimination. So if we look at the 1910 census data, you start to see that new immigration reflected in some of the states. Look at the Scandinavians in Minnesota and the Dakotas. And to this day, many people there do trace their ancestry. they're coming to farm, they're coming to be businessmen and professionals, and they tend to cluster there. In some other states, you do see now, again, Southern and Eastern European countries mentioned, and some interesting ones too, such as Italy. 1910, the largest foreign-born group in Louisiana are Italians. You know, who would have thought that? That's interesting. Connecticut, 1910, they're Italians. And Austria is the #1 group in Pennsylvania. I dare say a lot of those people would have been in the mining industry, but nonetheless, you start to see this now pretty well reflected in some of the states. Well, let's talk a little more about discrimination and eugenics and scientific racism, social Darwinism, too, the idea that there are various differences between groups of humans, and that nations and individuals and races, so-called, are inherently competitive, and that to use the term, the stronger survive and the weak don't. So the whole eugenics movement was actually to cull out undesirable aspects of human behavior through a whole variety of methods, including things like sterilization. But it also included immigration acts. So the desire now was to cull out or keep out undesirable immigrants. The desirable immigrants, of course, were being defined largely by people of Northern and Western European ancestry in the United States. So the people they wanted to keep out largely were the Southern and Eastern Europeans, and certainly Asians they wanted to keep out as well. There were actually 3 acts passed between 1917 and 24, but we'll focus mainly on the ultimate act, which is the National Origins Act. That was the most extreme of the 3. So what it did is establish a quota of immigration. Immigration per nationality, literally per country, was limited to 2% of the number of people of that nationality who were present in the United States in 1890. All right, and I'll show you an example in a minute. So how many people of English ancestry were in the United States in 1890? Answer, quite a few. How many people of Polish ancestry were here by 1890? Well, not as many as would be here later. So this was really aimed at limiting vastly the number of Southern and Eastern Europeans, because there weren't yet a huge number of them here in 1890. There were many more people with Northern and Western European ancestry. It also capped the total number of immigrants coming from outside the Western Hemisphere to 165,000 per year. So that was a huge reduction in the total number of immigrants here. Interestingly, there was no cap on immigrants from the Western Hemisphere, i.e. from Canada or Latin America. That wasn't considered to be a problem. And in fact, Latin America, particularly Mexico, that was a labor source for the United States. Asians were almost entirely excluded. The one exception would have been Filipinos, because actually at this time, the Philippines was an American protectorate, and they were allowed here. But other than that, with very few exceptions, and actually this went back to 1917, Congress established what was called the Asiatic Barred Zone. Essentially, if you're from Asia, unless you're from the Philippines, don't bother trying to come here. We're not going to want you here. And in terms of the 165,000 people allowed in from outside the Western Hemisphere, preference was given to families and also skilled agricultural workers and their families. So let's just look at an example of how this worked in reality. And you can look at that chart if you like, but we're going to look at Italians. So if we look at the average number of Italian immigrants to the United States per year from 1900 to 1910, it's 212,000 per year, just from Italy come to the United States. Very large number. So again, that's over 2 million, 2.1 million, just in this 10-year period. They're coming very large numbers. But again, many Americans don't want them. They're different, they're foreign. There's a whole debate, are they even white people? In an era of what we would consider rampant racism. An act I didn't talk about, the Quota Act, which was a predecessor to the National Origins Act, reduced the total number allowed from Italy to just 42,057. So that's a huge reduction. And then once we get to the National Origins Act, there's the number, 3,845. And consider, what are your odds of getting a visa, in that the people who have first dibs are people who are here, who are trying to bring family members over. So once those visas are gone, there would have been very few visas left for anybody else. And that was by design. And again, much the same thing would happen to immigrants from the Russian Empire, from Poland, and from other parts of Southern and Eastern Europe. Their quotas were minuscule now as compared to what they had been. Well, there had been no quotas, actually. And now disproportionately, what these acts did was to encourage immigration from the older source areas, Northern and Western Europe. The National Origins Act then was the basis of American immigration law for the next 40 years. And it would change the country's demographics dramatically by design. So you start to see some impact even as early as 1940. You still see lots of Italians and Russians, but you start to see now more certainly German and English immigrants being a largest group. Canadians too. And then if you just look at the total number of immigrants coming from 1930 to 65, and this is roughly the period the National Origins Act is in effect, you know, just the total number now is vastly smaller than in the decades prior to the National Origins Act. And the Germans are the biggest group. The Canadians are big, the Mexicans, Caribbean, and West Indian peoples. Because keep in mind, there's no quota for Western Hemisphere peoples. And the only Southern or Eastern European country that shows up here is Italy. There's still significant numbers, but vastly smaller than prior to the National Origins Act. But that would change. 1965, and this is literally Lyndon Johnson signing what would become the Immigration and Nationality Act, excuse me, in 1965. And he's doing it on Ellis Island. It might be Liberty Island, I'm not sure. There's Bobby Kennedy. There's a Secret Service agent, I'm sure. It's got to be, right? Hubert Humphrey and a cast of thousands. Keep in mind, this is the era, the modern civil rights era. So there's increasing sensitivity in the country to ethnic minorities, certainly Blacks and others, women too, but including immigrant minorities. We also have to consider that a number of immigrant groups had lobbied for decades to change immigration law, to liberalize, to get rid of some of these quotas and restrictions. Also, the Soviet Union, this is the era of the Cold War, you know, beat the United States over its collective head for its civil rights record, its treatment of ethnic minorities. So all of those things would culminate in this act, which really completely changed American immigration law. And this act really is the basis of modern immigration. So this gave priority in terms of immigration to relatives of US citizens and legal permanent residents. So it's really going to encourage chain migration. And to this day, the largest number of immigrants who come here either have relatives who are US citizens or who are legal permanent residents. You know, they get in line first. They have first dibs for visas and for coming here. It also gave preference to people with skills. And as an aside, I can't imagine an immigration policy that wouldn't do that. You know, it benefits the country, obviously. And also political refugees. There are carve-outs for refugees. It didn't maintain quotas per country and per year, but it exempted relatives of US citizens from the quotas. And for the first time, it limited immigration from the Western Hemisphere to 120,000 people per year. So there is now a concern here. We don't want to be completely overwhelmed by people from Mexico and more broadly Latin America. So we're going to kind of control that. So if we look at the census data of 1980, you start to see now the results of that 1965 Immigration Act. Now, in much of the Western United States, the Mexicans are the single largest foreign-born group. You know, interestingly, the Germans are still there as late as 1980 in many, many states. The Italians are, the Canadians are along the border. This is an interesting case, Vietnam, the Vietnamese in Louisiana. A number of reasons for that. And obviously this would have been 5 years after the end of the Vietnam War. So part of this was chain migration. It was families either moving there to rejoin other family members or having moved to other parts of the United States, moving to Louisiana. Part of it is the climate. If these people were from South Vietnam, the Mekong Delta, you know, the climate is similar. The terrain is somewhat similar. The Vietnamese make up a very large part of the shrimp fishing industry in Louisiana. And that really is because of this emigration to Louisiana. So it's an interesting case study of you know, one group ending up in a state that, again, you don't think of Louisiana and Vietnamese going together, but there are a lot of people of Vietnamese ancestry there. And then if we fast forward to the most recent map I have, this is 2013, now we really see this transformation of immigrant source areas. Not only are we not seeing people from Southern and Eastern Europe anymore, we're not really seeing people from Europe at all here on this map. We're seeing people overwhelmingly from Latin America, Mexico #1, or Asia, and that's more recent. And that's been the great transformation in American immigration, really since the 80s, the 1980s, we start to see this, but certainly, particularly in the 21st century, it's the shift away from Europe being the primary source area to Latin America and Asia being the primary source areas for immigration. So I have data through 2015. Third wave immigration. This is post 1965 Immigration Act. You know, Mexico alone, it's over 16 million people. And I think we all know the reasons for this immigration. #1 is economic opportunity. People come here to work. Mexico is, I believe, still the wealthiest Latin American country, but you know, per capita income pales obviously in comparison to what it is in the United States. The rest is geographic proximity. Countries that border each other, where you have this sort of disparity in economies, you're going to have immigration. Whether it's legal or illegal, you're going to have it. And we see it here. It's interesting, all of Europe during this period, every country in Europe collectively, it's fewer than 7 million people. So the whole continent. China now, India, the Philippines, South Korea, lots of Asian countries. And then again, some more Latin American countries at the bottom. And I had to throw in the Canadians. They're still there, but you know, relatively small numbers. I'm sorry, I had to actually borrow from 2 graphics here and try to marry them as best I could. So it's not perfect, but if we look at the line here, what this shows per census year is the percentage of people in the United States that were born abroad, born in some other country. So you see some interesting patterns here. So that data was first collected in 1850, where people were asked, where are you from if you were born somewhere else? So we don't have census data prior to 1850. But you see a few patterns that are interesting. One, in the 1870s, in the 1890s, you had a dip. Well, we had two depressions in the United States that were actually global during those periods. And people actually tend to move more frequently when economic conditions are good. Maybe counterintuitive. They don't tend to move as often when you have depressions. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Why would you go from one country where you can't get work to another country where you can't get work? They tend to wait. So, much of this period, you see the percentage of Americans born overseas between 13 and almost 15%. That's pretty much the norm here. The National Origins Act would have been in somewhere in here. Now we're establishing those quotas, and now you see the results of that. The percentage steadily declines until 1970. And the 65 Act would have been in here. And that was by design. So the United States really became, what should we say, less pluralistic, because it was not accepting in large numbers of immigrants, and that was by design. Now with the 65 Act, we go in reverse, and we see this steady increase in the number of Americans or residents born overseas. The most recent data is from last year, it's 14.2%, which is not a record. But if current trends hold, it's estimated that even in the next census, that will be a record. The United States has never had more than, in a census year, 14.8% of its residents having born abroad. So that is the direction we're headed. So if you get the sense the country's changing, and I know you all know it and see it, but it is. It's definitely changing. You have a lot of people from abroad that are living here. Just a couple of more graphics. 1960, and again, this is 5 years before the 65 Immigration Act. The top 10 countries for people born abroad. And with the exception of Mexico, it's all European countries. By 2010, well, it's completely changed. There's not one European country on this list. It's all Latin American or Asian countries. And I actually looked at 2020 data. It's the same group of countries actually on this list. It's the same 10. The orders changed slightly, but it's exactly the same 10 countries. So this great shift from Europe being the source area for American immigrants, again, to Latin America and Asia. And just a slightly different way of doing it. 1960, a foreign-born population in the United States, 3/4 of them are Europeans. The other quarter is everybody else. And now Europeans currently it's 10% or even a little less than that, down from 75% in 1960. And Latin America and Asia, combined is about 3/4 of the source areas for people born abroad that live in the United States. And just before I wrap up, and I'm pretty much done, sorry if that went on a little too long. This is a tabulation that the Census Bureau put together in 2010, which shows by county the largest self-identified ethnic group. So this is literally the Census Bureau asking people, what's your ethnicity? People responding accordingly. So again, you see some interesting patterns here. So if we look at African American, it's still very heavily concentrated in the former slave states of the Confederacy, interestingly enough. It's not to say African Americans don't live elsewhere. We know they do. And you see them in some cities up north, but you still have that population in those former slave states. You see in the green, Scandinavians still show up very strongly. In the Northeast, you see a lot of people of British ancestry. You see the Italians in Connecticut. You see the Irish. But again, the thing that really stands out, well, we should also throw in the Mexicans, people of Spanish or Mexican ancestry. That's no great surprise, largely in the Southwest. But look at the Germans. Again, this kind of overlooked ethnic group. Look at how many counties in the United States. In some states, it's almost every county except one or two. The largest self-identified ethnic group, German Americans. Sort of interesting. And that is it. And I think that's enough. But thank you for bearing with me, and I hope that was worth your time.
Dr. Coan, that was fantastic. I loved it, loved the maps and everything. Wow. I could ask you probably 1,000 questions myself. However, I will defer to others who have a question. I would say if you want to, everybody, if you want to take your microphone and unmute yourself. And Dr. Coan, would you like to stop the sharing so you could see people? Or
Yeah.
would you like to? Okay.
I think that's better. So let
Okay.
me-
Then you
see
could
if
see that you could see folks and folks could see each other a little bit better.
There we go.
There you go. All right. So yeah, fantastic. Woo, wow. Lot of information there. Stephanie has a question. Stephanie, where are you?
I
don't see you.
thought I knew most of this, but it was fascinating. I didn't know it.
Oh,
It's
there you go.
wonderful. It really has been a wonderful hour, whatever it is. I'm curious about one of the slides that showed so much Mexican. I think we know, I mean, that's where they're coming in, but they're coming up from, I mean, they're coming over from Haiti, and they're coming up from all the other South American countries that have so much drug turmoil that the Mexican is, I think it's a name that probably should be Latin America, I think. That's my impression. Nowadays, they have to get in through Mexico, so they have to come. I mean, they fly in, they come from Cuba to Mexico, so they're still considered Mexicans. Is that slide that time correct?
Right. So again, those slides indicate that the largest self-identified ethnic or national group. So these would have been people the census is picking up saying, I'm from Mexico. I was born in Mexico, living in these various states. And again, it's most of the states of the United States now. It's actually the largest foreign-born group are people from Mexico. Now, keep in mind too, many of those people, it's their relatives moving in because the immigration law favors that. It's people who already have Mexican relatives here as US citizens or permanent residents. They're allowed to bring over other relatives. They get in line first because of immigration law.
So a point of order here. If you go down to reactions, everybody on the very, very bottom, and you click on it, you can see raise your hand. So if you'd like to do that, I did see Marge had a question though.
Yep.
But others, if you click on the reactions on the bottom, click raise your hand, then I can choose you, pick on you. Oh, go ahead, Marge.
Pick on you.
My sister and her husband are farmers in the Midwest, you know, orchard people, but I mean, in the Midwest, there were a lot of Mexican people who came up to work on the farms in the Midwest. And a lot of them did stay, but they were, you know, recruited to work on these farms.
So they might be under the migrant worker program.
Migrant, yeah.
In many
the migrant
cases, yeah.
worker, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, we know there's this vast labor force of poor people from Latin America who do all sorts of labor in the United States, farm labor, the meat processing plants, as we found out during COVID. We didn't know that before, and so forth. And you know, it's a double-edged sword. We're happy to have the relatively cheap labor, but for them, it is opportunity. It's something they might not have available to them in Mexico.
Thank you, Dr. Coan. We have Bob Heron up on the top there. Well, he's at least on the top left for me. Go ahead, Bob.
Up left for me too. I was wondering, another graphic I'd like to see would be the difference between a large urban population and a small rural population. I've been digging into Rocky Hills history, and we're small rural. We were pretty much dairy farmers. And my impression going through all our stuff is you have to be more accepting of people when there are fewer people to draw from. I don't know
Right.
what you think of that.
Yeah, and another, if you need their help, in other words,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
'Cause I
Yeah.
heard we got along pretty well with the Irish, after a
Yeah,
bumpy start.
I mean, I have a theory it may hold water or not too. In terms of immigration, there's always the fear of the other. We know that there are, it's a constant point of tension, and it's not unique to the United States. This is global. This happens in every country in the world. People moving over who speak a different language or perhaps of a different religion, have different customs. They're viewed with suspicion because they're different. And people aren't familiar with them. I tend to think in America, generally, Americans are more accepting of small numbers of immigrants from different backgrounds than they are large. It's when the numbers get large, that's when people start, we're being overwhelmed, being invaded, the country's being changed. But I don't know if I can prove that. I just sense that generally that's true.
Oh, yeah, I think if you lived in a little town in Nebraska, population 500 and 100 Indians moved in, you'd probably pretty much freak out. Yeah.
Time to move maybe, or what have you, exactly.
I see I have my hand raised. Oh, good. I'll call on myself. Thank you, Ed. I just wanted to say, if we go back to like one of your first slides, the Historical Society, we actually have a Clovis point.
Ah, interesting.
Pretty cool, huh?
It is.
Yeah, we're going way back in time for that one.
Yes.
Like I said, I have many questions. Now I'm gonna hit you with two, if I may. What was the allure in Nevada for my Gumbads, for the Italians? I'm Italian, Ciccarello. So that's one. And then secondly, we had a discussion early on when we were beginning to discuss the idea about diversity, about the word melting pot. And so we were advised not to use it. So I heard you mention it. No opinion on my part, no judgment, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts were. So the Italian in Nevada and then the melting pot. So
yeah, the Italians in Nevada, I'd really have to dig into that. I don't know, to be honest with you. The number one reason people move is work. We know that. It's economic opportunity. Beyond that, I really have to research that. That's a good question.
okay, fair enough.
Yeah, the melting pot thing I know has become controversial. There are all sorts of theories of immigration and interactions between different cultural and ethnic groups. There's assimilation theory, there's acculturation, and so forth. And yeah, I do think there's something to the melting pot. This is my own personal opinion. I do think at any given time, there typically is sort of a broad American culture, however loosely defined, but certainly right beneath that, you do have all of these significant differences too. But I think the thing that holds the country together, or has for the most part, are those commonalities. There are some commonalities. But on the other hand, there are big differences too. So certainly the idea of immigrants coming here and losing their identity, that doesn't happen. It certainly doesn't happen. I don't think it ever happens. People do retain their identity. The question is, to what extent do they? What do they hold on to? How fiercely do they hold on to? And that's going to depend from group to group, individual.
Mhm.
But clearly, too, I think every immigrant group that moves here, and again, it's not unique to the United States, will be changed by being around, other ethnic groups and different cultures. It's inevitable. They have to be changed to some extent.
Thank you. Gail Tyne has a question.
Yes, I had to unmute myself. I had a comment on your question about Nevada. Now, I would think moving to New England, it was because the Italians like gambling. And they moved to Nevada. Come on.
I'm glad you said that, not me.
Then, Dr. Coan, this is the third time I've heard presentations of yours, and I've enjoyed every one of them thoroughly. The last one before this one was the one you did on the Asian immigration, which I found fascinating. You did that for Bloomfield. But my question was, and I couldn't see it on my TV, my phone, what were the little yellow circles and all that covered Kentucky on your last slide?
Yeah, without going back to it, there was one of the answers that people gave for self-identified ethnicity was American. I think that's what you're referring to. So you've got this swath, sort of in Appalachia in some of their areas where people identify themselves as American, which is interesting. And they were given the liberty to, write whatever they wanted. And that's what they wrote, the majority in those places. So what explains that? I don't know. It's an interesting response.
No, because however, I grew up in Kentucky.
Mhm.
I never had any difficulty pronouncing anyone's name because their last name was Brown, Green, Black, Arnold, any name you could just say. So when I got here, my tongue got tied
Yes.
for a while until I could get those, combinations of the J's and the K's and all of those put together. So I guess I'm not surprised when you said that now, asking them, because they're not going to identify or really care about their ancestors there. It's just, what are they? They consider themselves American.
There you go.
Yep. So thank you very much. And I've enjoyed it again.
Thank you.
I think I see Stephanie has a question again. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Again, and not just because I was born in Kentucky, but I was never asked my ethnicity until I moved from wherever the other places I had lived to Hartford. And then one of my husband's friends, I hadn't married him yet, the husband that is, said, "What are you?" I said, "What do you mean? What am I?" "Well, what are you? Where are you from? What's your?" I said, "I'm not anything. I have no idea what I am." "Well, you have to be something." "I don't know. I'm not anything." And I didn't know. I knew that I wasn't some things, but I finally, to this Irish group, said I was probably a wasp, and he gasped and let it go. I really had no idea. My parents had thought about it, and once somebody in Kentucky tried to find someone who would tell them, but there was no way. Now, of course, I spit in a tube and it got sent off, and I'm discovering I'm Scottish probably, but I didn't know, and I don't answer ethnicity on anything that's sent out. I do not consider myself at all Scottish. I'm American. I mean, I'm nothing. I say nothing. I don't go other. I say nothing. You don't usually have to. You can say not Hispanic, I think, is the other choice. So there are those of us who I'm just happy being nothing or everything.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and one theory of ethnicity is people only kind of acquire ethnic identities where they're in contact with people that are culturally different. That's when it becomes important. Where you have more cultural homogeneity, it's probably less important. It's not something one thinks about, but certainly growing up in a place like Connecticut, and I'm sure a lot of you had this experience. I went to school with kids with French Canadian names, with German names, with English names, with Irish names. For whatever reason, that was important. We weren't just Americans, we were Americans of some ethnicity.
Right.
That was important to, and I suppose it was important to us because it was important to our parents.
I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, and I knew what religion people were, but that was the only only demarcation that I recognized.
Thank you again. Any further questions? Marge, you're on mute. You want to unmute yourself?
I can't find the place where you put the hand, so. When it comes down to my kids and grandkids, if they were to ask about ethnicity, really ethnicity, they're all combined now. I mean, as the generations keep going, my grandkids are German, English, Estonian, Scottish, all kinds of different things as the generations
Yes.
go. And I think it's true of so many Americans now that they're, they're all different things, all mixtures of things.
And to me, that's the melting pot.
That's the
That's-
melting pot.
And,
That
if
is
we're concerned
definitely-
about tensions
Yeah.
between
Yeah.
various groups, maybe that's the salvation is actually, it's called intermarriage,
Mhm.
Mhm.
where these differences now, we hope because of love, right? Become less important, and maybe at some point, not really important at all. One can hope at least. But there's a long history of that in this country too. It's just initially it doesn't typically happen, but it happens over a long span of time.
Oh, yeah, I think you froze up
I have a
there,
question.
Dr. Cohen. You still with us? There you go. There he is.
Yeah.
Somebody else had it?
I had my hand up, but I think it disappeared.
Who is there? Oh, Sandy. Yes,
Yes,
please.
thank you. Dr. Cohen, this has been fascinating, and I want to piggyback on what Marge has said about it's just difficult to be anything these days. As she said, I look at, my son and granddaughters, and it's just, there's so many. And when you look at, I mean, I guess they can still say white if that's what's one of the choices, but to look at an African-American, Hispanic, maybe with some Asian, I mean, how important is it still going to be, or how are we really going to use nationality data in censuses going forward? And how can we be accurate if we think it's something that's necessary?
Yeah,
That
and
makes
that,
sense.
what the Census Bureau has done since 2000 particularly is now give people more liberty to define themselves. Prior to that, it was really the census taker deciding what box you checked on. They decided whether you were black or white or what have you. And obviously they'd ask questions if you were born abroad, what country. That's pretty straightforward. But now it really is whatever people think they are. And ethnicity, what is ethnicity too? It's a very difficult thing to define, isn't it? Is it where your relatives are from, which is probably all over the place for many of us? Is it where you were born? Is it your skin color? Is it your religion? Is it your language? In a sense, it can be any combination of those things. It's really what we think, what we identify.
Thank you.
Now, I have another question, Dr. Cohen, and feel free to what's the word? Not answer the question if you choose. I know when I talk to my good friend Bob Heron over here, and I try to get him into speaking about current politics and stuff, he says, I'm a historian. And so, he wants to keep that hat on, although we sometimes get into politics. So seeing that you laid out such a marvelous historic timeline of laws from the beginning of time to pretty close to the present, would you, with that knowledge and that foresight now that you have, is there something that you think that would benefit the United States at this time?
I just want to say thank you for giving me credit for foresight. I really don't have that, or would have sold all my stocks a couple of days ago. But unfortunately, that ship has sailed. I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of your question?
Well, I'm wondering if, because you have all this knowledge of the past, right? I mean, isn't, we say, we study the past so we could have a better future. So do you see something that, I mean, obviously you look at immigration much differently than I do. And so is there something that that you feel could benefit the United States in its sort of a general sense? Laws or
Well,
policy?
clearly, immigration law is in desperate need of reform. I think any sane person would tell that. The difficulty right now is politics on all sides. There are vested interests here, political interests that are just resistant to doing that. But we those laws are in desperate need of review and change to some extent. And I could give you some ideas of what I might do. I'd rather not do that, but I think any sane politician would tell you that. It's just, they're afraid of their voters if they vote for something that's going to be a compromise. And ultimately, that's what we're going to end up with at some point. There is going to be a compromise. There are going to be changes made to these laws. And nobody's going to be entirely happy with them. And if there's a genius to America, I think that's what it is. We usually stay about 2 steps ahead of the revolution. Because usually before the revolution happens, there's change. The change never really fixes the problem, but at least it mitigates the problem. And it postpones the revolution, and we kind of get along. I really do think that's the genius of America. It's compromise. And where compromise breaks down, obviously that's when we have big problems.
I think you either have a beginning of a book there or a great song, 2 steps ahead of the revolution. Yeah, I don't know. That sounds insightful.
I fear
to me.
I fear we're 1.5 steps ahead right now, just barely tippy-toeing around.
Yeah,
It's
Yeah.
a scary period, definitely,
yeah.
because
Well-
of the entrenched interests.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I don't have a lot of faith in compromise and.
And again, that's not a partisan comment. It's entrenched
Oh, no.
interests on every side.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But your presentation really put it in perspective for me, for sure. You know, things that are going on now ain't the first time it's been going on, man. You know,
No.
it's a continuum. And I think the graphics, the maps that you showed were amazing, really quite amazing, you know, eye-opening to me. With that, I'll just sort of scan the crew here and see if there's any last question. Seeing none. Well, listen, Dr. Coan, I want to thank you very much. I don't know how we clap if you put your hands up in the air like this or something
Please.
like that.
Thank you.
So
You're very
thank you.
kind. You're very patient.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for sticking with me.
Well, you have an audience that is very interested in this subject. This year, we, you know, it was one of our goals is to begin to discuss this issue. And we have a group called Sustainable Rocky Hill where, you know, people are talking about equity. We have an innovation and inclusion committee in Rocky Hill. Lots of things are going on. So to continue this conversation and to have the information that you brought to us tonight, I think is going to help our community and help people to become aware. And so here we are as a historical society. Our hope, right, is that learning from the past is going to influence our future. So once again, thank you very much for coming.
Yes,
And
Thank you.
everybody,
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
yes,
you.
indeed.
I'll say good night to you, and I'll see you all at Academy Hall or in Rocky Hill somewhere. Thank you all for attending the annual meeting of 2022.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Good night.
Take care. Great job.
Thanks.